Hello and welcome to the Questioning Behaviour podcast, where we get to be unprofessionally curious in a professional way.
So professional.
So professional.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying. You're the dummy that don't believe in science.
What are we talking about today, Meta?
Today we're actually looking into neuromarketing, which is a really cool field that I hope will continue to develop.
Yeah, even the name sounds super cool. But I'm a bit of a novice, so what's the difference between sort of neuromarketing, neurobehavioral science, and sort of cognitive neuroscience?
Well, before we jump into it, let's not pretend that I'm not a complete novice. I've had 2 courses in my entire life that had neuroscience or the word neuro in the title. But from what I understood is that neuroscience is the general umbrella term for it all. So neuroscience is genuinely looking at the brain. This can be from a clinical perspective, so looking at people that have abnormal behavior, say, for example, schizophrenic, look into their brain, see what's going on there. This can be on a structural or a functional level, which is just what is the brain like, how is the brain formed versus what is the brain actually doing. But there's many other forms of neuroscience, including cognitive neuroscience, which is more where psychology comes into play. So normal psychology, so decision-making. So you could arguably call that decision-making neuroscience. There's social neuroscience as well, which is predominantly how we interact with people and how that manifests in the brain, what the brain does as a reaction to that. And then there is the more businessy side of it all, which is where neuroeconomics and neuromarketing come into play, maybe even neurofinance, although I'm not entirely sure how established that is as a field. Where neuroeconomics, I suppose, came first on the businessy side, which is just economic decision-making in the brain. So how do we calculate value? How do we attribute value to a choice or to a product, a good or a service, you name it. And then how do things like time and delay factor in? How's risk calculated in the brain? How do we perceive certain things? And then neuromarketing is even more specific. So I'm not entirely sure if neuromarketing is then a subfield of neuroeconomics or just a subfield of cognitive neuroscience. But in neuromarketing, you're, I think, quite actively looking at preferences. So what do you prefer? Why do you prefer it? And especially, how can I trigger your brain to really, really enjoy something? Predominantly products and services, I suppose, if you're talking about marketing. But yeah, it's all quite different. Neuroscience is a relatively young field, but it's a really broad field, and there's so much cool stuff you can look at when it comes to the brain.
So I know you do love a definition, but you might have to draw me a map, because it sounds as though there's sort of loads of subfields within sort of neuroscience, and all of which could potentially map on to behavioral science. So that makes it particularly interesting. And I guess before sort of the MRI machine and these sort of technologies were invented, neuroscientists were restricted to just looking at case studies in patients like Phineas Gage. Do you know that guy?
Oh god, yeah, he got he got something jammed into his prefrontal cortex. I'm pretty sure. It wasn't like a dynamite thing, or was it just like an iron rod or something?
I think it was definitely something to do with building a railway line. I think that's what I remember from science class. But
I think you're right. Yeah. I think they were using TNT, because by that stage I think it was still legal to do so, to blow up, I don't know, like a mountain that was in the way or something. And then
as you do. Yeah.
As you do, of course, naturally. And then I think some of the debris that came off of this explosion actually jammed through his prefrontal cortex. So I'm pretty sure it went either like through his chin, or at least through his nose, and then stuck out of his head. So the prefrontal cortex is like the front part of your brain. It's predominantly the one thing we don't share with animals. It's what makes us more human, I suppose. But yeah, this man lost some typically human traits like patience, social skills. A lot of his established personality got lost, because that's all kind of stored, if you will, in the prefrontal cortex. So yeah, that man had he changed. He changed.
It's pretty traumatizing.
Oh no, but I thought it was a miracle he was alive.
Yeah, bless him. And then he became known for being the guy who had a big rod stuck in his brain. What a legacy.
Or, a changed personality. I think he predominantly had like a really short temper and aggression issues. I think that's the main thing that came out of that. But yeah, that's what they used to do. You had to wait for someone to either be normal beforehand and then have an accident or have a degenerative disease, and then track them and see how they changed. Or you had to find someone who was quote unquote abnormal from the beginning, and that's quite rare. And if you're counting on that as a field, it's going to be a very slow development. But I mean, like you said, now we've got the technology to actually, put people in brain scanners, put them in MRIs or fMRIs, apply EEG to them and see what's going on in the brain. And I'm sure that technology will only get better and more detailed, more accurate. So we should come closer to the truth, whatever the truth may be.
And they call economics the dismal science. I tell you what.
I don't know. I mean, there's many things you can call this. I think it's cool stuff. Other people might think it's going absolutely nowhere, but I think it's cool stuff.
Okay, well, I guess we should stop talking about a field we know nothing about and ask someone who knows a bit more.
Yes, and today we're actually talking to Matt Johnson, who is actually a neuromarketer, so he should know the field. He's also recently co-written a book about neuromarketing, and it's many different applications in the real world. So Matt, please take it away. Okay, and today we are actually speaking to Matt Johnson. So Matt, introduce yourself. Who are you? What are you? Where are you? How are you? And when are you?
Well, thank you so much for having me. So my name is Dr. Matt Johnson. I am a professor, writer, and researcher within the field of consumer neuroscience, and I'm the author of Blindsight, the mostly hidden ways marketing reshapes our brains. I am currently in Oakland, California, which is sort of the Brooklyn of the Bay Area. So we're right across the bridge in terms of being here in the Bay Area from San Francisco. And I am doing well. I think those were all of your who, what, where, whys, and whens.
Okay.
And congratulations on writing a book, by the way. Huge achievement.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. I think we probably, in terms of timing, like now, it's in terms of the marketing and promotion stuff, but it's this like perfect period right now for writing. And the book is completely written and it's in physical form already. So, I think we're about a year too late or so. So next pandemic, I'll plan it better.
Yeah. Oh, damn. I hope you're not suggesting there is going to be a next pandemic next year.
Let's hope not. Hopefully it's still once every 100 years or so.
I'll settle for that.
That's about as much as we can take. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So Matt, how did you get into behavioral science?
It's a good question. So I originally come from the academic field. So I did a PhD in cognitive neuroscience, and there I studied the neurobasis of learning, neurobasis of memory. And these were topics that I studied completely independent of any sort of application whatsoever. So I wasn't thinking about business, wasn't thinking about marketing, wasn't thinking about really anything, but just diving into these topics of our mental faculties. And then when I graduated, I actually made a transition to business consulting work. So when I graduated, I was, effectively in 25th grade, and I just needed to do something very, very, very different than what I'd been doing for the previous, up until that point, 28 years of my life. I went straight from undergrad to PhD program. So needed something just very, very different. And so I went into business consulting, and in some ways, it was pretty similar to what I'd experienced in academia. You're still applying your analytical abilities and you're still researching, but now it's very different in terms of the application, and it's much more oriented to finding solutions and less to sort of drilling down on these kernels of truth that you're able to unearth sometimes in academia. And it was really through this intersection of being able to have this understanding of human behavior and then seeing how this is sort of manifesting in the business world that you really stumble onto this really rich intersection, which goes by many names: behavioral science, behavioral economics, neuromarketing, consumer neuroscience, but really this massive intersection where insights about the brain, insights about human behavior, human psychology really intersect with the business world and business behavior, consumer behavior.
So how would you say neuroscience is contributing to, let's just call it behavioral science, although yes, it has many many names, but how is neuroscience contributing to behavioral science, would you say?
It's a good question. So clearly, I think they're both, the object of inquiry is pretty similar across them. So whereas the tools of behavioral science might, fall more into using behavioral and psychological techniques, behavioral experiments, neuroscience is obviously trying to take the hood off a little bit and sort of look underneath at what are the neural processes which are inculcated while these decisions are unfolding. And so I think one sort of unique contribution that neuroscience can make there is it's able to tap into processes which just don't show up so readily in terms of overt behavior and overt psychological responses. So the classic example here, and I love this experiment, it's been replicated in different settings, is this Wilson and Nussbaum behavioral experiment, where they bring participants into a room and they just show them this array of stockings. And they chose stockings because who knows about stockings? Like, no one has any strong opinions or any insights. No one's a stocking expert. There isn't a PhD in stockings that I know about. And so no one really has any specialized knowledge there. And so they come in, they just pick whichever stocking you like the best. And so people make their selection and they bring them back, a couple hours later, ask them why they selected the one that they did. And for whatever reason, and no one exactly understands why, humans have this right side bias. We tend to just default towards the right, especially in instances where the problem space is vast and there's high uncertainty. We just default to the right. And so when people are asked, well, why did you select this stocking? In actuality, people selected the one on the right about 50% of the time. But when asked, well, why did you select the one on the right? Nobody has any idea that they just, have this right side bias. People said, oh my God, I love the color in this one. It reminded me of, the way my mother used to, make stockings. I love the material. This one, matches this. They confabulate all these reasons because our introspective abilities actually just don't go that deep. And we oftentimes don't know our own minds as well as we might think we do. So introspection is a fantastic tool, and overt behavioral responses, try to probe our own mental abilities, is a fantastic tool, makes fantastic contributions, but there are instances where this is limited as well. And so the promise of neuroscience and neuroimaging techniques is being able to really tap into these mental processes, which we as the authors of these mental processes just don't have access to.
Amazing.
Super fascinating. I mean, in my mind, when I imagine a neuroscientist, I think of someone sticking people in MRI machines and asking them questions. How much of that is a myth or a preconception, and how much of that is reality?
No, I think you're definitely spot on there. So I did a bit of fMRI work when I was in graduate school, some EEG work as well, where you're not actually eavesdropping on the entire brain as the process is unfolding, but just the electrical signals that are emitted from the scalp, which can tell you a bit about what's going on in the brain, but more in terms of how quickly something is being processed or if it's being processed at all. So yeah, there is absolutely, neuroscience is very concerned with trying to gather as much neuro data as possible really directly. And so for every sort of behavioral experiment that sort of is looking at the limits of introspection, there are some neuroimaging findings which speak to that as well. So one of my favorites there is from Greg Burns at Emory University, and he did this with trying to predict hit songs. And so he put people in the fMRI machine and he had them listen to these pre-released songs before they actually hit the market. And then he actually measured if these songs became hits roughly, 4 or 6 months later, once they actually hit, the general market. And so we had two pieces of data. One was just how much did you like this song? To ask them just the overt behavior response. And then he also had the contributing neuroimaging data. And what he found was that people's behavior responses were almost completely independent from the future success of the song. So how much you actually just subjectively reported that you liked it was independent of its actual future success. But what was much more predictive was activity in a region of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, which...
Oh, the reward center.
Yeah. So there's certainly some nuances there, and we can't speak in complete generalities, but it's effectively our pleasure center, right? So it's associated with this very visceral response of pleasure, which is also something that we have a very poor introspective read on. The degree to which we viscerally enjoy something is typically not the same thing as we'll overtly say. So there's the whole idea of sort of guilty pleasures, these things that we enjoy, in the privacy of our own homes, but, don't want to tell anybody about, even when, consent and everything is there in terms of the experimental confines. So, I think there is quite a bit of contribution that neuroscience could make there directly.
At least definitely in the music industry. I mean,
absolutely.
I would love to see my brain light up when I listen to the Spice Girls. I'm not ashamed, I'll admit it.
So I guess all of these sort of insights are very interesting academically, but what are the sort of the key ways in which neuromarketing and sort of neuroscience insights have had an impact outside of academia?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think the biggest application has really been in terms of perspective. Not so much. So there is a branch of neuromarketing which is, let's, instead of A/B testing this or getting some sort of behavioral data, let's actually get neuroimaging data. So I have a good friend, an associate that does this down in Los Angeles with movie trailers. So you spent all this much money making this, $1 billion Marvel movie. Now you have to promote it, and a big part of that promotion are these little 30-second clips. And so what's classically done is that you show these to focus groups and you fine tune and this and that. But there they've again found they've converged onto this general idea that people aren't able to predict this so much themselves. You can glean a bit more insights and much more predictive of whether this is going to be successful or not. Ends up being their neural responses. In this case, with EEG. So there is definitely some direct application there. I think the biggest contribution for me, as I mentioned, is really in terms of perspective. And so especially with technology, there's this major emphasis on behavior and A/B testing. And so the classic example is with media stories, for example. So you test all these different headlines, and whichever headline gets the most clicks, that's the one they end up going with. So it's a very widespread technique. New York Times does it all the time. They'll A/B test these two things. Then whichever one wins becomes the permanent headline. And the other headline that didn't get enough votes just is never, ever seen again. The winner becomes the permanent headline. And so it's a great approach if you're optimizing for behavior. But the same behavior can be predicated by completely different psychological predicates. So you can click on this headline because, oh my God, that looks so interesting. It's going to add so much value to my life. Or you can click on this ad because it's like, oh my God, I hate this. This is so stupid. What's behind this button? I'm going to, really critique that. I'm going to, get angry at this article. I'm going to post about it on Twitter. I'm going to get upset. And for the past 5-7 years, especially here in Silicon Valley, the dominant technique has really been A/B testing. And you're optimizing for behavior because obviously that's very important to marketers, very important from a business standpoint. That leads to conversions. But you have very little idea about the actual psychological experience you are creating. So I think a much more neuroscientifically informed perspective really leads us to appreciate the actual psychological, conscious moment-to-moment experience and not just the behavior that might result from that.
So it's really offering us key insights into the mechanisms and not just looking at outcomes.
Absolutely.
Super interesting.
Yeah, well said.
Actually, when I think of neuroscience in business, I'm actually not thinking of anything that positive, not to be rude, but there's a lot of... so this is the thing. So neuromarketing specifically, although I should rephrase this differently. So the marketing of neuroscience, because that's a very different field, has actually gone a bit berserk in business, if you don't mind me saying it. Because I think there's a lot of neuro nonsense out there where there's a lot of products coming onto the market. I think smart water is one of them, or these type of brain stimulating tools. So if people wear this weird looking helmets or this weird looking headphone, that they could study better because their gamma waves or some type of wave is being put into their brain and their memory should become better and whatever. How do you feel about those types of things, Matt?
Yeah. No, that's an important point to bring up. So there's actually a paper that came out in 2008 which spoke to that directly. And so for whatever reason, the brain has just become very much in vogue. And having a neuroscientific explanation or even imagery of a brain actually it seems to be a bit more persuasive. And that's what the paper spoke to. So they had, two types of explanations for something. One which had a purely psychological explanation. So it was like meetings in the morning tend to lead to better memory retention. So talking about purely psychological mechanisms. The other article had a picture of the brain and said meetings in the morning stimulate the medial temporal lobe and lead to greater afferent connections within the hippocampus. And they both say, roughly the same thing. One is a psychological explanation, one is the neuro explanation. And by far, the neuro explanation led to much greater adoption and was perceived as much more persuasive. So I think that's an interesting philosophical question, is really why we see the brain as having much more persuasive explanatory power. When they've done these types of studies in the general population, most people do have a dualist perspective. They think the brain is independent from the mind, and the brain is different. But as we know, having studied this, the lion's share of the evidence really is in the monist perspective, and the brain and the mind are fundamentally the same thing. And so having a neuro explanation shouldn't provide anything different than a purely psychological explanation, and yet it definitely does. And we definitely see this in the world of business as well, whether it's smart water or brain stimulation. I think the biggest one for me, and sort of my personal pet peeve with that, is brain training techniques. So these are applications and platforms like Lumosity, for example, that'll claim that if you play these games or do these exercises, that this will increase things like intelligence or working memory. But there's really no evidence to suggest that the gains that you make within the small confines of this game have any general application to other types of scenarios. So you get better and better and better at these very, very specific games, but then, once you're not playing this game, you don't have a working memory capacity that's any greater than you did at any other time in your life. And so, there's still really no good evidence to suggest that working memory can be boosted, and no good evidence suggests that it can be boosted by these types of platforms. And yet, because the brain is in vogue and it becomes much more persuasive, you speak from a neuroscientific perspective, we do see these types of platforms take off a bit more. But I certainly share your sentiment that you see one too many of these and your eyes just naturally sort of roll back into your head a little bit.
And I guess we've talked quite generally about the entire field of neuroscience and neuromarketing. But I wonder, do you have a specific interest in a very specific corner of that world, or are you sort of more of a generalist, would you say?
So my neuroscientific training is really in terms of learning and memory. And in terms of the application to the consumer world, it's really about, for me, I'm interested in everything. I'm interested in really, if you open up, a textbook of a Psych 101 book, there's, perception, sensation, perception, learning, memory, decision-making, sociality. I'm interested in really all of it. But what I personally find most fascinating is experience and memory. That really, when it comes to what marketers are trying to create, yes, they want to create amazing experiences, but at the end of the day, you can have the most amazing experience that you could possibly have. But if you don't remember it, then it has no benefit to either the person or the brand. And this is where we do see this sort of strange sort of relationship between experience and memory, that not all, we sort of intuitively feel that every time we're having an experience, we have the record button on. And that every time we're trying to bring a memory into mind, we have the rewind button on. But neither of those things are true at all. And it doesn't feel that way. And this is, again, sort of speaks to the limits of our introspection. So we know, for example, that when we're having an experience, certain types of experiences are weighed much more heavily in memory. So emotion is weighed much more heavily in memory. High attention situations are weighed much more heavily. Introducing a bit of friction into the experience actually seems to boost memory a bit. So there's this font that was created called Sans Forgetica, which is one of the elements we researched for the book. And the font is like deliberately designed to be a little bit difficult to read. So if you look at like a Times New Roman or an Arial, it's very easy. It's very fluent. You have high fluency effect. You like what you're reading. With Sans Forgetica, they deliberately made it a little bit difficult to read. So you can read it, but you really have to focus, really have to strain your attention. And they found that if you have text, which is written in Sans Forgetica, you have an actual stronger memory for the information encoded in that text at a later date. And it really comes down to this idea of introducing a little bit of friction into the experience, forces us to strain our attention, and then boost the memory a bit later. And so I think this is a really fascinating thing to look at from this perspective of marketing, because really the bona fide rule for most of user experience is you want to reduce friction. You don't want, a lot of clicks and necessary thinking from stage to stage to stage. And that's definitely true in terms of conversions and in terms of the enjoyment of the experience. But in terms of memory and trying to build an impression, a little bit of friction seems to actually boost that process. So overall, I find this intersection between experience and later memory really fascinating.
Is that also what lies at the core of your book? Or tell us more about your book. What is your book about? Or is it all about memory?
It's good question. No, so we take certainly do talk about memory, and that's the only topic we have 2 chapters dedicated to, because it's really pretty vast. One on experience and one on how experiences influence us later on and how we recall and sometimes confabulate and smooth over previous experiences in a drive to be consistent. And so the book in general is really a deep dive into us as consumers from the standpoint of psychology and neuroscience. So really it's organized chapter by chapter in terms of our psychological faculties. So we have chapters dedicated to sensation and perception and learning, memory, decision-making, how pleasure and pain influence our both consumer decision-making and our motivation, empathy, and our sociality, storytelling. So really for each area of our psychological faculties, really, where does marketing come in? Where does this manifest in terms of our consumer behavior?
All right.
Fascinating. So it sounds like you've covered the sort of the vast and sort of almost any sort of aspect of the way that people can experience and feel the world has sort of been covered in this book. Is there a favorite example that you have?
Ooh, good question. So
only one, Matt. You may pick only one example out of this entire book.
Yes, this is like asking you to choose your favorite child. I understand.
I think for me personally, in addition to the learning and memory stuff, it's really fascinating to see how early in our formulation of reality marketing can have an influence. And so as psychologists, we've sort of known this for decades, and it's again one of those things we don't realize in our moment-to-moment experience, but we don't really experience reality directly. We experience our brain's mental model of that reality. And this is especially true when it comes to taste. So our sense of taste is arguably taste and olfaction are our 2 weakest senses. We're very visually dominant creatures. And so really when it comes to the construction of our reality, our mental model for taste is extremely, extremely malleable. And so there is always going to be this gap between subjectivity, what we're experiencing inside, and then objectivity, the way the world actually is in its physical iteration. And that gap between subjectivity and objectivity, that really is the marketer's playground. They really do get to sort of sculpt our experience of reality directly. And so we see this, again, as I mentioned, with our sense of taste. So if you're led to believe that this bottle of wine is very, very, very expensive, or you're led to believe that this bottle of wine is very, very cheap, you'll actually experience it tasting at the level of the tongue, at the level of your deepest gustatory experience of it very, very differently. So if you're told it's expensive, you like it more, you want it more, you actually see increased activation in the nucleus accumbens. So Baba Shiv down at Stanford did this with fMRI. If you're told it's a cheaper wine, we associate cheaper with being lower quality, and we report not enjoying it. We don't want to have it again. And so it's the same exact wine that actually is touching our tongue and causing a reaction in our taste buds, but we experience it very differently because our mental model has been construed by the beliefs that's been instilled about what we are consuming. And the biggest sort of scaled up example of that is Coke and Pepsi, the famous Pepsi challenge. So when you are drinking Pepsi, but you're led to believe it's Coke, you actually enjoy it much more. Coke still spends $10 billion a year on advertising, sort of grilling into your temporal cortices that happiness equals Coke. Coke equals happiness. We're going to make that the distance between your these two nodes of your associative network as close and synonymous as possible. And so if you're led to believe it is Coca-Cola, all of this association we have with Coca-Cola actually influences your raw perception of the experience. And so I think there's certainly quite a lot to critique about marketing and a lot that can be improved. But I think it's just incredible how deeply marketing can influence our most rawest experience of reality directly.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. Marketing has completely warped how people perceive something as, to me, as simple as a beverage. But going beyond the book, do you think the Pepsi versus Coke research, is that one of the coolest papers to come out of neuromarketing as a whole field?
So the Pepsi challenge in general, this was a marketing campaign dating way back to the 70s, and it kept going for many, many years. And it was, for most of its existence, has been purely behavioral. So you're just looking at responses between people. And then they did do this with a neuroimaging twist with fMRI. This was Damon Tomlin, and I forget the collaborator. This was done back in 2007, I think. And this is where you do feel, if you're drinking just a generic fuzzy brown liquid and you're led to believe it's Coca-Cola, you do have one, increased activation nucleus accumbens, but also increased activation in your temporal cortices as well, which, again, you can't get into too much in terms of reverse inferences, but this is a region associated with our sort of semantic network. And when you have damage to this region, you have nausea and you have a difficulty with object finding and object naming and things like that. So it altogether sort of suggests that we do have we're influenced really down to the core of our both pleasure and our associative network by virtue of all the branding that we are exposed to.
So these are almost like weapons of mass influence. A term that was shared with us with one of our other guests, which I think is absolutely amazing and definitely applies here. Yeah,
just to add to that, I mean, I think there definitely is, a lot to say about the ethics of these types of very, very powerful marketing interventions and marketing campaigns. I think it's also worth noting just how amazing these experiences can be, though, and somewhat of the debt that we do owe to these marketing experiences. So they've done similar experiments as Coke Pepsi, but now with a brand like Nike, for example, whereas Coke is happiness, Nike is aspiration, Nike is victory, and Nike is achievement. And they found that if you hit golf balls with a Nike branded golf club, it's the same exact golf club as somebody else is using, but you just slap a Nike logo onto it, you'll actually hit the golf ball a bit farther. So you have this sort of placebo effect driven by the brand that we wouldn't ordinarily have if not for the brand itself. So it's not merely about the products that these companies are creating, but really all of the beliefs and associations that they have created for us by virtue of all of the advertisements and brands and everything else.
So if I want to run a marathon successfully, I should just deck myself out in Nike gear.
Absolutely.
How much of these effects sort of persist even when people become aware of them? Is it sort of a case that this is all very unconscious, and then when you suddenly reveal to someone this link between, oh, you've just hit that further because there's a Nike logo on here, or you've told me that you like this one better because I've told you it's Coke when it's actually not. Like, how much of this influence is sort of taken away when these sort of links become conscious, or does it persist, do you think?
That's a really, really good question. So I know in the general placebo effect literature that when the person is told somewhere in the intervention, hey, by the way, these are actually just sugar pills, these effects still do persist. So you still have this latent belief that what you previously had, and that still has an effect on this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. I don't know what's been done in terms of placebo effects with that type of placebo effect sort of nuance when it comes to brand effects. I can speak from my own experiences, though, after doing the research and writing the book on it, and you sort of see how the sausage is made, it doesn't make you want the sausage any less. So I know all these effects that Nike's doing, all these brand effects, placebo effects, but I still love wearing Nike shoes. And at an intellectual level, I know that I can probably run perfectly fine with Adidas or Puma, or probably, a generic brand that, doesn't have much branding at all. But I just, I like, it's one of those things where you something at sort of an intellectual level, but in terms of your visceral enjoyment of it, you can't really argue with that.
Yeah. And I guess these are all examples of sort of a positive effects. Are there any examples when the effect is quite negative? So if you think you have these beliefs about a certain product or a certain experience that there's actually sort of negative affective outcomes associated with it?
It's a good question. I mean, I imagine, that the same would work in terms of sort of a negative placebo effect. So if you're led to believe that, this will make you a worse, athlete, then you'd probably run, a little bit worse there. And I think it can be a little bit of a zero-sum game in people's minds. So if they're led to believe that this is definitively the best brand for athleticism and victory and personal achievement, not having that is, oh my God, I'm not performing as good as I possibly could. And sort of therefore, even if the brand didn't brand themselves as we're the mediocre brand, in your mind, if you're led to believe that this other brand is synonymous with maximal achievement, then the other brand, logically has to be less than that. So yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if that's been done specifically, but I would imagine that those sort of effects take place.
So for the brain, being a good brand doesn't matter. You're either the best brand and your brain is like, oh, fuck yeah, let's do this. Or you're not the best brand and your brain is just tuning out. Like this, lost cause, don't even have to start this marathon. I'm not at my optimal game anyway. Let's just call quits while we're at it.
I mean, it really comes down to the consumer as well. Because really the brand, it exists on an individual consumer level. I mean, the brand exists nowhere else but in the minds of consumers. And everyone experiences these things slightly differently. So the reason why we generally all have a consistent association with a brand like Coke is because they've done such a massive wide-scale advertising. But different people in different markets where things are a bit more split, some will perceive Adidas as being like the dominant aspirational, when you have to be your best, you're Adidas. Others, that's Puma. Others, that's maybe Nike or Reebok. And so it really just exists in the brain of the consumer. And so there's always this sort of arms race amongst brands to sort of be the dominant one in the minds of the consumer.
And something you said earlier, which sort of managed to worm its way into my mind a little bit, is this idea that, all experience of reality is an indirect experience. That's kind of crazy. It's almost like when someone tells you that you've never actually touched anything else in your life because there's sort of these atoms between everything. So you've never actually physically hugged anyone or touched anyone properly. It's all very indirect. It's kind of a very scary thing to say. There's so much room for influence, I would say, because everything's so indirect. Yeah, no, absolutely. It is a little bit trippy to think about for sure. And it's not necessarily just with brands in the consumer world as well. So in perceptual psychology, this is the case with white light. So we know by virtue of physics that white light is all of the hues of light combined into one, but our visual system perceives it as being white light. We know from studying the visual systems of other creatures that what we have as humans we don't see the full spectrum of visual light. There's some creatures that see beyond that and see into infrared and can see heat and things like that. We know physically that these things are emitted, but we just don't perceive it in terms of our limited visual system. So yeah, our perceptual system is a great tool to be able to understand external reality. And of course, it's the only we've ever had. And so we assume that it's synonymous with reality. But there are these examples where we see this disconnect between actual objective reality and what we're experiencing internally. And what do you think the role of technology and sort of the increasing our use of technology has had on shaping our perceptual system. Because I picked up on, you were talking about things like when you're having an experience, you want to sort of slow that down, rewind, pause. These are the actions that you would associate with sort of a VHS tape or an MP3. I don't know why this is stuck in my brain a little bit, but so how much do you think has us living our lives through technology affected our own perceptual systems?
Ooh, it's a really, really good question, and the work that has been done there really suggests that if you're watching something through your phone, if you go to a great concert and you watch it through your phone or you film it, your actual memory of it is worse. And this is Diana Tamir's research at Princeton. She's done a lot of great work in this domain. So even if you watch it later and even if you rehearse, it's still worse than actually having experienced it there in person. So now instead of, being there in person and having your full attention, you're sort of watching it through this device. So you have another layer of difference between reality and your own sort of subjective experience. And a lot of times also when you're watching through technology, trying to record things, you're not necessarily focused on the current moment. You're sort of focused on sort of the secondary, tertiary process. Like, oh my God, it's going to be a great video. And in this part here, I'm going to have a little 20-second thing on Instagram, or you're thinking about, what you can do with this and the sort of the story that you're going to tell about it, that you're not as focused on the real experience as you might otherwise would be. And so there's a lot to say about the ethics of technology. We do actually have a chapter related to the addictiveness of these technologies, and that's another topic. But I think one underappreciated thing here is just this what it might do in terms of our perception of experiences, and then the later impressions that we at least hope to get from these experiences that we might not have in such richness if we watch them through these devices.
So why do you think people do, make an effort to pull their phones out at concerts? If there's sort of evidence to suggest that people's experiences are much worse because they're watching an experience through their phones, why do we see this happening so often?
That's a good question. So first, I think people don't realize necessarily that you're hindering your later memory for these things. And secondly, there's just all sorts of incentives for being on social media and utilizing technology. So, maybe on the downside, one small downside is that you're not going to have, an actual personal memory of this with as much vivid detail. But on the plus side of using this technology, you're, able to share this with your friends. You can post this up on Instagram and get the social equity for going to this concert. You can get all the likes and the comments and all of those nice little dopamine hits that you're getting from these technology platforms. So there's all of this incentive which is built into using these platforms. Yeah.
Staying in the domain of technology, when looking at neuroscience or looking at what I've been taught about neuroscience, I thought the main constraint about what we know about the brain is currently driven by technology. So if we were to have better technology for understanding the brain, so if fMRI suddenly became much more portable or EEG would go much, much deeper, then we would know more about the brain. At least this is something that I have always been taught. Is that something you agree with? Better technology is better insight into the brain?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think the technologies that exist today, and there still is plenty that can be improved on in terms of granularity and how much depth you can really explore things, are just a huge, massive contribution to our understanding of psychology and neuroscience. Before, the invention of CAT scans, fMRI, I mean, all you really had is neuropsychological cases. You had to wait for some unfortunate person to have some very unfortunate brain damage, and you had to very closely monitor their behavioral and perceptual sort of issues that they were facing after that, and monitor their behavioral profile. And then if the family agrees, then you get to do an autopsy and see exactly where this damage is. And then, here's Broca's area, here's Wernicke's area, here's area V4 in the occipital cortex. It must be associated with this. And so we're light years ahead now in terms of being able to take a direct look into the healthy brain as these types of processes are unfolding.
So in an ideal world, what would neuroscience look like if we didn't have any technological constraints? If there were no constraints, what would neuroscience ideally be able to do?
It's a good question. I think it gets into a little bit of a philosophical debate. So you could, in principle, if the technologies do become as advanced and sophisticated as we might hope, you could, for example, put somebody in an fMRI machine and you could know with almost guaranteed certainty that if they buy this this is the optimal product for them to buy, or the optimal experience for them to have, or the optimal movie for them to watch, or, you just get that level of detail. Sure. We see some of that promise already, but this would be, much more advanced. But then you're sort of faced with this sort of philosophical question that if you can, in principle, predict what would make you happy, and then you get that thing, by virtue of being able to predict it, it would make you a little bit less happy. And so we do see this major effect of this joy of random pleasures. And there is a bit of just intrinsic enjoyment we get from the unknown. There's this really, really lovely speech that the philosopher Alan Watts gave, and he sort of posed a question, which I think sort of touches on this. And so if you could just have anything in the world, what would you want? And you sort of imagine that you're at this huge computer, and you press a button, and you listen to beautiful symphonic music. You press this button, and you get to be transported back and interacting with Cleopatra. You press this button, you just have all pleasures of the world right there in front of you. And you look down, and all of a sudden you see a button called surprise. You click that button, and you're right here in Sausalito, California, talking with Alan Watts. And so it's this kind of idea that at the end of the day, yes, of course, we want pleasurable experiences, but if we can exactly predict what we're going to be able to have, it takes away from the pleasureful response. And so I think that's really the promise of these neuroimaging techniques, to be able to predict with increasing certainty what is the optimal product or experience somebody should have. But then it gets into this sort of almost pleasure chicken and egg issue, where if you can predict this, then it ceases to be pleasureful. So yeah, it's a little bit of a sticky issue there. But I think we're a long ways from being able to deliver people optimal pleasure. So no worries there. We're not going to max out our pleasure response or anything.
Yeah, it's sort of like the idea that, you reach heaven and you can be there for an infinite amount of time, but you'll get bored eventually, if everything's just at your fingertips. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely.
I love how Sarah just casually equates being able to fully understand the brain to heaven. The true nirvana is complete neuroscience.
Well, if you can harness it, potentially. That's the thing.
Potentially. But I find it interesting, Matt, that when you mention, say, full understanding of the brain, what you're predominantly focusing on is pleasure, but there's much more to the brain than knowing what is pleasurable and what isn't. Totally.
Right? Yeah, so I was thinking more in terms of the application and sort of a neuromarketing understanding. So definitely in terms of understanding the brain and how it gives rise to our psychological experiences, there's clearly much more than just our experience of pleasure. I think if we could, in principle, have a complete understanding of the brain, so you could just press a button and you'd have, the exact constellation of neural activity, which, supports that psychological experience. I think at that point, we really need to more closely narrow down which questions we're trying to ask. I think a lot of the boundaries that we have constructed out of convenience to be able to study the brain would really dissipate. So we talk about things like perception, learning, memory, as if they're almost distinct processes, but we're learning more and more that there's just rich overlap between these things. And the way that we think about them as scientists, the way we think about them as lay people going about the world, this is just a convenient way to understand our experience, but it's not the way it actually exists in terms of both psychological and biological reality.
Yeah, I think it's the funny thing about experience is that you can have empathy and sort of understand the sort of the structural and the sort of logical processes and the sort of the scientific models of experience, but it's very different to be inside a person's head and actually experiencing that. So do you think that neuroscience is limited in the sense that you can't know 100% what it is like to experience the world, or is there a sense that actually it is possible to know pretty much everything about a person's experience?
Ooh, that's a really, really good question as well. I think to the extent that people's brains follow a stereotyped architecture, you could be able to tell that within pretty good sort of confidence intervals there. So you know, for example, that if somebody's visual cortices occipital lobe is activated, they're having a visual experience. We know that much. But if you have activation in fusiform face area, fusiform gyrus, they're probably looking at a face. But this speaks to the fact that in most people, the fusiform face area, fusiform gyrus, is in roughly the same place and is endowed to roughly the same region. There's going to be slight variations there. So, if you have, slightly different, neural circuits which are activated, you might have a guess, you might have an understanding generally about what that indicates about the person's psychological experience. But since we all are wired slightly differently, we couldn't be able to tell that with absolute certainty. So I think understanding the evoked activation of the brain will get us, part of the way there, especially as these become more sophisticated. But there's always going to be sort of a little bit of wiggle room there.
Keep the mystery alive.
Yeah, exactly.
I love how this is now turning into also our dating episode. Also, one of the key messages from our dating episode was keep the mystery
Nice.
alive, which apparently is the same for the brain, which is great.
Everything comes back to keeping the mystery alive. All roads lead to Rome.
Where do you think the sort of interesting research is at the moment? What's the sort of frontier of neuroscience and neuromarketing? An area which you think should be explored or is currently being explored that's quite interesting?
I would say two things. So the first is experiential marketing. And this is something we saw was sort of a burgeoning field right before the pandemic, where this was sort of really trying to optimize for both the moment-to-moment experience and the lasting impression that you're trying to give. And these are things like festivals and in-person activations, pop-ups, things like that, where people are really digging into perceptual science, really digging into memory science to create these amazing experiences and impressions. And obviously that's taken a big hit given the current situation. But I still think there's just incredible promise there because we can really, we're sort of in the Alan Watts world where you can have almost any song ever written at the punch of a button. You can go on Netflix and watch, any movie that's ever been recorded ever. So you can almost have, any pleasure, which is sort of digitized. But really what you can't have is actual these in-person experiences. You can listen to, Spice Girls, for example, going back to Merle's favorite band. You can't, have the direct experience of of being there in a concert and having this above and beyond light show and the feeling of the crowd and who's your favorite Spice Girl, Merle?
Okay, I am not that much of a fan of Spice Girls.
You're messing up my example.
Yeah, come on. I think it's Scary Spice.
All right, Scary Spice.
Scary Spice.
So,
we can't digitize Scary Spice, sort of having a direct empathetic connection with the crowd. And that is something that just can't be digitized and that consumers really, really crave. And so in the past few years, we've seen this huge investment, a huge upsurge in terms of experiences, especially in the music industry where people historically, haven't made much money on actual music themselves. And now in the age of Spotify and YouTube, make almost nothing once music becomes digitized. But the one thing that they have is the actual in-person experience. And so they've really sort of doubled down on creating these incredible experiences that people are willing to pay for and have as memories and experiences for the rest of their lives. So that would be definitely one area that I'd really be encouraged if we see an upsurge of in the future.
If the technology ever allows for a portable fMRI, I am perfectly happy to attend my favorite bands in concert whilst wearing it. If that is, for scientific input, of course.
Totally. And I think you'd be one of the only participants where you'd see, an actual consistency between your overt behavior response. Yes, I love the Spice Girls, and your nucleus accumbens activity. Yes, I have a visceral, pleasurable response to Spice Girls. So you own it. So well done there.
Thanks. I'm afraid I wouldn't be able to take you to the Spice Girls. I don't think they do concerts anymore. But will you settle for Muse or the Arctic Monkeys? Is that fine too?
Oh, I would definitely go to a Muse concert for sure.
I like how you're trying to
establish
that your music taste is not quite just the Spice Girls, just covering yourself.
Yeah, a little different.
I can do alternative rock and that type of stuff.
Oh gosh.
Sort of. Matt, out of this entire episode, what is the one key message that you would like the audience to take away?
Ooh, yeah. I mean, probably going back to our conversation about subjectivity to objectivity, that we don't experience the world directly. We see that in with tastes sort of most profoundly, because that's our weakest sense. And marketing, for everything that we can say about it, it's needing to improve, and manipulation and the ethics of it, they can create these just amazing experiences of reality, and that really is the marketer's playground.
And Matt, if the listener wants to keep up with what you're doing and check in with your new book as well, where can they find you online?
Thank you for asking that. So they can find all of this on my website at PopNeuro.com. So P-O-P, neuro.com. And then the book is Blindsight, the mostly hidden ways marketing reshapes our brain, which can be found on Amazon, or also links for it on our website as well.
Fantastic. Well, good luck with the book launch.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yes. By the time people will be listening to this, the book will be out. So.
Oh, fantastic.
Yes. Yeah, the book does release on the 19th of May. I think this episode will release approximately a month later. I'm not making promises with regards to that schedule. But yeah, guys, go get the book. I think neuromarketing is a field that we're going to see, or neuroscience in general is a field that we're going to see a lot of very interesting developments from. Most definitely, I hope soon, but at least within the upcoming decade. As soon as, technology moves forward and we have those portable fMRIs that I'm going to be rocking everywhere I go.
And thank you so much, Matt, for your time today. It's been great talking with you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Wow, so I think that was an amazing discussion. Thank you so much, Matt, for coming on to the podcast. Merle, we talked about so much today, but what did you really take away from this conversation?
I mean, I'm still trying to collect my thoughts. I mean, when we introduced neuromarketing, my idea was that it was, super business oriented, but we discussed a lot of philosophy in this episode, which, I mean, cool stuff, but I'll reiterate, it's not my forte. But no, for me, I think what I thought was really, really interesting is that there is no such thing apparently as a negative placebo, which I'm quite curious about, because I would like to be able to find that in people. I love how I'm like, I would like to find it in people, as if I'm, doing neuroscientific research.
And as if you're like an evil mastermind who's like, no, I really want to find out a placebo effect that affects people negatively so I can use it to my advantage.
I mean, is that not what I'm like? Am I not an evil researcher to you? Should I work on my reputation some more?
You are more to me than just an archetypal Bond villain, Merle. I hope you know that.
I really appreciate that, Sarah. That's made me feel much more emotional than I thought it would.
No, but I think you're right. I think it's interesting. We had this conversation about placebo effects. And I think something that you said, which I thought sounded really intelligent, was sort of like, even if there's no, we would call sort of a negative placebo effect that we could think of, just not being the best or associated with being the best in the market, it is almost, simulates a negative placebo effect.
Well, I mean, I'm glad you thought it sounded intelligent, but who knows if that's true? I genuinely don't know. And I mean, another thing is that, I mean, Matt already indicated this, to some people, when it comes to like exercise equipment specifically, I suppose, to some people Nike is the best, but then go to another country and suddenly Adidas is the best, and then go to another country and it's Puma or Reebok, or, I don't actually know that many sports brands, if I'm really honest. But, so it kind of depends, which then, if that is how it works, if there is a positive placebo effect with being the best in the market, then it makes a lot of sense that all these brands spend millions, like hundreds of millions, just on marketing, because it has worked for Coke. Because,
Yes.
You want to drink Coke. Your brain literally wants to drink Coke. It prefers Coke more to Pepsi or to anything. And I think that's just, from a marketing perspective, that's really, really impressive. Like, then you've made it. Then you've properly done it.
But I think you're right in the fact that it does take a huge marketing effort to establish these placebo effects. So it's something that needs to be ingrained over time and culturally, and you have to see it everywhere for it for it to start having a real effect, I guess, on your actual behavior, which is something interesting that I think Matt said, the idea of you hit a golf ball further if you're using a golf putt or a golfing stick. What the hell are they called? Golf club. You're using a golf club with a Nike logo on. Like crazy weird things like that, where you sort of hear that result and you think, really?
Yeah.
Can that be replicated? I want to see that. I want to see the statistics on that. But it's an interesting thought, I think.
Yeah, I find it curious because I know the placebo effect exists. I'm not a placebo denier. I also think the Earth is in fact round and moves around the sun.
What?
Yeah, no, like I'm not a denier. I believe most things have actually happened. I'm sketchy about the moon landing, but deviating from this train of thought, I'm just curious as to what extent these type of placebos work, because obviously Coca-Cola has always hit happiness as a target core value, and Nike has always hit success. This makes a lot of sense for the sectors that they're in. I mean, happiness in a beverage, all right? I mean, sports equipment and success, achievement, whatever, that makes a lot of sense. But I'm wondering if these are very like core values for a person. I mean, happiness is one of the 6 basic emotions. Achievement and success tends to lead to happiness, so you can make that link. But I'm wondering if you go a bit deeper and if you dive into much more complex emotions. And now when I'm thinking of, complex emotions, I can only come up with negative ones, such as shame. I don't think a single brand wants to target shame, but, take a complex emotion and take a positive one. I'm wondering...
The Catholic Church?
Yeah, I mean, the Catholic Church made a real brand out of shame and guilt, so I suppose it was quite effective. Also nice for hating on the Catholic Church.
Sorry, guys.
No, it's true though. They built. I mean, a lot of religion is targeted towards shaming and guilt tripping you into complying with certain rules and not engaging in certain behaviors. But I'm wondering from a brand perspective, if the emotion gets much more complex, if it works as effectively. Maybe it works even more effectively because branding and marketing tends to be done in social settings. Complex emotions tend to be experienced in social settings. I don't know. I wonder. I feel like this is much of a tangent, by the way.
It is, but I think it does link back to something that we talked about. I think marketing as a discipline, they're just kind of interested in outcomes. So doing A/B testing on names of articles, titles of articles to see which ones get the most clicks. But what they're not necessarily interested in, or maybe they just don't have the tools to investigate, are the sort of the mechanisms behind why people are clicking, which I think is really interesting. And I think that's something that this field can really lend itself to.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. No, it's a really good point. I mean, we're hoping that this field is going to give us not neuromarketing per se, but I think neuroscience in general is going to give us a much better idea of what's going on in the brain, and that some people might make the exact same decision but have very different mechanisms for arriving at that choice, arriving at that outcome. And that is going to be very interesting. But I think once you understand what's going on in the brain and how you can manipulate what's going on in the brain, I think by that stage, and I'm not talking about, next year we're going to see this massive invention. I think this is going to take several decades because we're also waiting for technology to catch up, which is fine. But I think once you know that, and we know this in much more detail, and we figure out the reverse inference problem, I think by that stage what you're going to see is a lot of sludging. I think once it becomes much more established in academia, and we can actually figure out causal effects and actually identify underlying mechanisms, then you're going to see a lot of nudging, which is good. If you think it's not too paternalistic, nudging is good. And but as a result, if the business sector understands that there is ways of implementing this to make a lot of money, whether that's to the benefit of the consumer or not, then you're going to see quite a lot of sludges. And I am very intrigued to see what sludging in marketing or neuroeconomics, if you will, looks like. I'm very keen to see how intense that is.
So I guess it links back to our episode on the use and abuse of behavioural science in public policy. But I mean, I think I should say, as a particular fangirl of mechanisms, so I'm a little bit biased because that's where my research interests lie, I thought that this discussion was so fascinating. Just in terms of behavioural science and sort of experimental methods, we're sort of limited to just observing what people say and what people do. Mm-hmm. And in a sense, these new technology, these new tools, and these new insights from neuroscience allow us to actually dig a bit deeper, or at least provide a new dimension, which is how people biologically and physically respond to stimuli, which I just think is so fascinating and makes me want to do another PhD.
You want to do a PhD in neuromarketing now?
Well, I think this is the problem with this podcast. Every episode, I discover a new burning passion to learn more about the topic we discuss.
No, I couldn't agree more with you. I think the neurosciences are an absolutely great field of study, and I'm very, very keen to see how they develop in all directions. But yeah, of course, with a specific eye directed towards neuroeconomics and neuromarketing. I think it's going to be cool. I'm excited. I'm eager to see it.
Me too. Me too. All right. I guess that was our episode, right, Mela?
I think that's it. Guys, thank you so much for listening. We hope you learned something cool, or at least had a very entertaining hour and a bit of listening. Let us know what you thought of the episode on the socials. If you have any more questions about neuromarketing, please reach out to us or reach out to Matt. All his stuff is linked in the description as well. And we hope to see you next week, and we hope you have a really good week.